Hello, Paul, and hello to anyone who is following our dialogue. This is a belated response to a video that I just found, a video of yours on Odysee. Probably a better platform than this one. Anyway, A Matter of Attitude and Attitudes Towards Matter is the title. I'll have the link to your video in the description to this one. And I will respond on the basis of a few notes that I have here as quickly as I can, getting to the points that you address. Now I'll go in the order of exposition. You refer, incidentally, to I want to be pedantic to begin with. You refer to an individual person as if there were such a thing. I don't know if you've considered my video on the individual, and I'm exposing what I thought was obvious, but that apparently is not obvious to most people, namely that what we call the individual is not a reality. It's an invention of the modern world. It's an invention that is responding to a Christian notion of God as individuum, something that you cannot divide. Okay, you refer to, now the main problem that you address is your impression that what I have been arguing is that today we're at a radical distance from classical antiquity, that we're in, that our notions, the world we live in is completely other with respect to the world the ancients lived in, and from this you mildly, vaguely conclude or suppose that I am taking an historicist position, that I represent an historicist prejudice against philosophy, ultimately, and against religion. I will go in order here. So you pick on my referring to Picasso, now, as suggesting that we do live in a radically new world, and so forth. I refer to Picasso as representing modernity, and yes, he's unprecedented with respect to pre-modernity. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to see not only that the looks of Picasso's monsters are new with respect to anything that we can see from the classical or the ancient world, there's something more to it. There is the notion of conquest of nature, okay, that was not carried out in classical antiquity. Again, as I have also argued in my work on the volume Mastery of Nature, we do have modernity in a very concise nutshell, with the story, for example, the intimations that we find in the story of the Tower of Babel. But modernity unpacks the implications of that warning, and it does so by turning the warning on its head, turning it upside down, and they're turning it into an advice, not a warning. We should go that way. And we should go that way based on certain considerations, arguments that would have been preposterous for the ancients. Do we find the seeds of modernity here and there in antiquity? Yes. Do we find modernity and its unfolding? Obviously not. Obviously not. Do we find this experiment and the manner in which it affects our lives on a daily basis, obviously not. Do we find this carrying out of that intuition into the shaping of language and of our experience? No. This is the point. Do we find this bubble, the modern bubble, in the flesh, so to speak? Do we find the second cave? No. Again, we find it in the respect that there is a warning. Look, there's such a thing as a Tower of Babel that is impossible, but we're warning you about this horrible thing that people could build, or when we could tell the story about their having tried to build it in the past, just to warn people of that possibility. But anyway, it's obvious that it's a exercise in futility because it'll collapse. You can see that by the very logic of the enterprise. It will collapse upon itself. It just doesn't work. So what's the point? It's absurd to even try. To reach the sky. Any ancient would have laughed, mocked at that prospect. Not the moderns. And the reason they don't mock it, they don't laugh at it, is that they accept certain arguments about the nature of things. Now, so in this sense, the modern is new, but not merely historically, constitutionally. Of course, modern means new, yeah, and the modern world is a progressive world, and you've never had a progressive world before, okay? Not in as far as we could see. It's unprecedented. The way we live, the way we look at things, is unprecedented. The people who wrote the story about the Tower of Babel did not look at things from within the Tower of Babel. So they don't tell us what it would mean to experience reality, what it would be like to experience reality from within the tower. They describe it from without, and they condemn it without qualifications. They show that it's an enterprise in futility. It's as if they had written a story about prostitutes without prostituting themselves and without really having the experience of prostitution. They know it legally as a crime. They do not live within it. Now, what I have argued is not that the natural foundation has shifted or changed. Okay? That is not at all what I've ever said. That would be historicism. That the foundation has changed. That would be to take the Tower of Babel for granted, accepted without question, and then enter it and live in it as if life within it were real life. No, the natural foundations are there. Alienation from them and the reification of those foundations, yes, is a new thing. The question, in practical terms, the question is one of reification, therefore. And now, so much for that. On the question of theology, theology is bound to the problem of authority. This was the problem that I had addressed. And to say that I am a religious man is very easy today. To say that I take the party of theology is more engaging as a proposition, because theology carries that weight of authority, religious authority. Everybody can be religious in the sense of having the sentiment, but when it comes to theology, it has this logos of the theos. Yeah? So the discourse of God, and that gets us involved in responsibility and heavy weight and the problem of speaking authoritatively. Now, Paul, you pick up pages of the Gospels because you respond to my reading of the Jesus story, and I'll have a link to that previous video that I have on this page, this site of YouTube, the channel they call it. Yes, I'll have a link in the description for that too. So you pick up a book by a biblical scholar, and this biblical scholar is an apologetic scholar. Obviously, there are apologetic pages, and they are giving you an account of the Gospels. They are articulating a story, and you seem to be taking that story for granted, as if it were, what is more, that as if it had authority, and I would even say scientifically valid authority. Does it? What kind of authority does it have? In the face of what? In the face of God? In the face of common sense, which today I argue is mediated by the scientific outlook, and so it is no longer common sense, it is obscured common sense. It's extremely difficult to recover common sense today, and just appealing to it and being silly or being thoughtless or being nonchalant about notions about our linguistic habits will not save us from the corruption of common sense. I will stress something that I thought was obvious. We have no pertinent literary sources preceding Paul. Where are they? They all refer or take for granted Paul. They assume that, things that are already in Paul. But Paul lived way after what we call the historical Jesus. Was he born on December 25? Of course, what is the meaning of these dates? Are they to be understood in an historical context? I'll get to that later. Here I jotted down a few notes. What is key to what I was saying is disclosed very well by Paul himself. Christianity is the Bible in and for Rome, the center of paganism. That is why I was saying that the Bible is, I said that I was referring to some scholars who speak of the Bible, the Gospels, as having been redacted in Rome. Whether they were physically all redacted in Rome or not, there may have been a center of scholarship in Rome, underground or wherever in Rome, where people were producing these accounts and these stories, and then there was a great variety of them. Finally, only 4 eventually were selected by authorities after the quite a while later, right? And then we're only left with 4 of them. But these various accounts reflected in their redaction, reflected the message that Paul articulates, namely that Christianity, or rather the message that he has to transmit, is to go to Rome, is for the Romans, is for the world, but Rome is the world in poetic terms, not merely in the abstract modern terms. I note here that the Bible had to be placed in Rome. Whence placed, so to speak? Yes, it had to be centered in Rome. Rome was the place where it could flourish. It could be born in its fullness. Whence its lesson could branch out in the international language of Greek. International for scholars. Yes? Why was it written in Greek? Because it was a language of scholars, serious writers. From the writings, you get to the oral transmission. These writings were not just born as such, as these texts were not originally simply oral Christian texts. They were, relying on an oral tradition, but that oral tradition was Jewish. Luke, Mark, etc. These are not. I hope. Are you? You seem to be considering these names as historically verified or factual. These are poetic terms. I mean, Saul invents the word, the pagan name for himself, Paul, right? Saul becomes Paul. He picks up that name because it's a pagan name, because his lesson, his message is to be, is to flourish, is to be cultivated from the center of civilization there, of the empire, Rome. So it has to be a Roman too, a Roman name. And so these names, Luke, Mark, these are to be understood in similar terms as linking the Jews, so the Hebrew Bible, and the pagan world. Let us not expect that there was Luke who wrote it, who was maybe some kind of a farmer or a fisherman or some kind of a worker, an ignorant person. He was whoever wrote that account, the Gospels, was a scholar of the Hebrew Bible. The text is well redacted. It's retouched, but it's pregnant with references to the Hebrew Bible. Whoever wrote it knew a lot about the Hebrew Bible and knew about Paul. So these, I think, is legitimate to consider these Mark, Luke, Matthew as poetic designations, somewhat as Homer is a poetic designation for the poets. They indicate versions among many others that have been redacted, as I noted, in the light of Paul. The Gospels are obviously written by sophisticated Jewish scholars whom the tradition will, for good reasons, present as ignorant simpletons. If the Gospels are translating a previous oral tradition, that tradition was Jewish, but the Gospels include, here I'm reading my notes, a philosophical jargon. This is key. It is simply, I don't know, it is, rationally speaking, it is silly to juxtapose Christianity and philosophy. Christianity speaks the language of philosophy. Without philosophy, you cannot have Christianity. You would have the Hebrew Bible. The Gospels include a philosophical jargon. The term nature, okay, it doesn't mean that the idea of nature was ignored by the authors of the Hebrew Bible. But now, the jargon which is used to account for and reify the Jewish Bible in a pagan camp. Reify the Jewish Bible in a pagan world for a pagan audience, so that the audience won't be, in fact, shocked. Okay? 3 days later, resurrected to the heavens. Had the pagans ever heard of such a thing? Oh, you bet. How it's understood, how the myth is understood, that's a different story. Now, if you take the Bible at face value, as you say, that is your choice today. You want to do so, even in the face of reason. It is no secret that the Gospels are crafted in a way that only intelligent scholars could have done. Consider numerology, the 12 apostles. Why 12? Why not 13? Why were the tribes 12? Why 3 days later? Why all these numbers? Do they mean anything or not? Or they were just recording them as journalists? I don't think so. And what about the pervasive textual references to the Jewish Bible? Okay? So now we can kid ourselves and take everything face value, but that is a willful act today because we're facing biblical criticism, biblical scholarship. And to ignore it or to assume that we can just take a reason-free attitude about the Bible is simply an act of the will, a conscious act of the will. Now, you are believing, and that's fine. Believe what you wish, but you don't believe simply in God there. You're believing in the story, okay, in which Jesus is the protagonist. Now, you can believe that the protagonist is real, but then the question is, real in what context? Well, in the context of the story. However, to rise from the story to its transcendent reality, and here I'm speaking in classical terms, is to rise to the meaning of the story, the message that transcends the story. Now, this rising, this ascent, requires study. The medievals understood this quite well. Faith for the sake of understanding. You try to figure things out. That requires study. You say, well, what about the farmer who doesn't understand anything? Well, he'll believe in the contents of the story, in the context of the story, because nobody's invented history yet, so he doesn't have to worry about it. And that's okay. When you read that 3 days later Jesus was resurrected, you're entitled to remain within the story. You take it face value. Yet in today's situation, you're faced inevitably with the problem of choosing between two contexts. Either your story is the true context of what you believe, as the old shepherd could have done, or the story in question is composed in a broader context that people today call history. And I think that you do this as well. You're speaking about Buddhism going on somewhere else, Christianity going on somewhere else. You're not speaking about the world as being the Gospels. There's a world outside of the Gospels, outside of the story of Jesus. So you're not a fundamentalist who looks at at the Hebrew Bible and says, okay, the world has 4,000 years. You don't do that. You say, well, there are dinosaurs' bones, and there's modern science is ugly, but it considers the dust from the stars and so forth. How do you respond to that? So what is the context of your belief? Is it the story? But then that presents a challenge, right, for us, because we're either naive shepherds without being exposed to this modern invention called history, singulare tantum, which is history without attributes. Not say it's beyond the distinction between sacred and vulgar history. Or we understand the story in the context of that history, and so we have a problem. So either the Gospels are true, or history, evolution, etc., is true. Let's make up our mind. Now, if we want to reject history, there's no talk about facts in the modern sense of the term, value-free facts. Okay? They're poetic entities. Fact comes from the Latin factum, which means made. It's something made. Something produced. Well, but it has a context. and it's inevitably tied to the problem of the verum, what is true. Now, either the Gospels are true or history is true, I said, unless, of course, you accept that the truth of the Gospels is not the object of any belief. Albeit, you can justify trust. You can justly, I was reading these notes, albeit you can justly trust that there is a truth to be sought. Okay? By rising from the story to its transcendent meaning. We're not dealing with departure from the particular to the universal here. All right? This is crucial. But departure from the whole world defined in terms of the dichotomy between concrete particular and abstract universal. And you, in your video, you do emphasize the universal. Jesus is the universal beyond the distinction between Rome and Jerusalem. Universal is an abstraction. The radical distinction between universal and particular is an invention. So, something that people came up with at some point. The ascending is, however, here from appearances to reality. And when you speak of reality as if it were something that your eyes see, you're speaking in modern terms. Okay, reality is that which is behind the mask, and you see the mask, not the reality. If you want to speak seriously, or in classical terms. So you're moving from objects of belief to truths of the mind. Now that's the solid stance that was carried on, was accepted throughout the Middle Ages as well. And of course there were nominalists and there were materialists in the Middle Ages, but the standard position, the official position was this. You move from objects of belief, okay, fides, okay, querens, it looks for the understanding, to the truths of the mind. Again, the fact that something happens, you speak about something happened there, it's a fact, is either in the Gospels, in the context of the Gospels, the story, or in history, the big story, the big secular story. And there the facts now are quantifiable in modern scientific, so-called scientific terms, which are Machiavellian terms. Okay. Is it important that the fact happened? Have I rejected facts as happening? No. Sure, they're important. It's important that facts happen. But the question in a serious discourse is for whom? Whom are they important for? Now, the fact happens always for someone. It serves as a means to rise to the truth about the fact. Okay, facts alone are just signs. Okay, portals to rise to something more fundamental. Now, you return in the course of your video to the question of materialism. Oh my, look, for the ancient materialists, this is quite, it seemed to me quite obvious, but apparently what I said does not come across as intelligible. I'll try again. For the ancients, the fundamental matter, the hyle, is whence we have silva, which is wilderness, so the wild stuff. The wood is not something that your senses perceive, but that your mind intuits. So Democritus' atoms are things that cannot be separated. If they cannot be separated, they're not in space. They're not in time. They're not physical. They're the foundations of the physical or empirical universe. Okay? They're in the void. Can you see the void? Can you see an atom? No. It can only be contemplated by the mind. But it's amoral. So it's contemplated by the amoral philosopher, namely the sophist, the one who escapes from the city and goes meditate in the forest, and there in the woods, you see, and discovers, what do you know? The reality is all of that. It is the wilderness that you contemplate, that you see in the mind, that you meditate on. So that is what matter is fundamental. And then when they say everything is water, oh, how apparently silly that is. No, because they're relating it to water being fluid. It is something like water or fire because it burns. There's something that burns underneath everything. So everything is fire. Everything is mind. Yes, because of course it's in the mind. Okay, but to just assume that these materialists, the classical materialists, were modern people, modern materialists, that's absurd. That's absurd. They were contemplatives. For them, ultimately, matter is a matter of contemplation. So, now, common sense understanding of time. You're suggesting that, it's untenable. What I'm saying about time is untenable. The ancients had the same understanding of time that we do have. Absolutely not. But this does not throw us back into historicism at all. It just means that we're living in an historicist bubble because we have reified all of the terms that are our linguistic terms, right? That make up our everyday speech. We have reified their sense. So, and this occurred through, at various points, through a kind of revolution. And you can see this in Jacob Klein's work on mathematics. You see that the notion of arithmos became reified, symbolic as a symbolic abstraction. So numbers acquire a distinct, and consciously so, it's a strategic revolution. It's not that they evolve accidentally. They acquire a function and a significance that you do not find in classical literature. Okay? So our notion of time, obviously, same story. And you see this in the Vogel & View article that I have on leaving the technological cave. Okay, I might get a little link in there. But if you or anyone ask me about it in the comments, I can always add it if I forget to include it otherwise. So, notion of time, not the same. Absolutely not. Does that mean they're radically separate? I said that our time is reified in a progressive sense. So it's not the same thing. And so the context of our experience is progressive experience. We have compulsions that are not unknown to the ancients, but our whole experience of things is obviously shaped by a language, as the ancients' experience was shaped by language. But that was the language of the first cave. This is what I'm saying. Can we recover the first cave? Yes, but it requires a lot of work, a lot of stripping off and questioning, and we have to question all of these obstacles that we're raised with, obstacles, blinders that prevent us from experience the world as it was experienced by the ancients. Consider the end. You refer to The City and Man by Strauss. Consider the end. Remember the end of the book? What is he referring to? The need to recover this first cave where things are terrible. Look at Strauss's references to, not in that book, but to Otto. So the holy, right? This recovery of this original sense of what is religion really about. There's something terrible, and of course Otto has its limitations, but what is important about the work is that it exposes, even though it doesn't clarify in a helpful way, but it exposes a problem that is usually ignored. And that's what Heidegger does as well. And Heidegger exposes something, even though he does it for the sake, for not in the right way or in the right direction, in an enlightening way, but he exposes a problem. And that problem is not an illusion. He's not creating it. It's something that had been covered up, eclipsed. On this same point, I have some notes. So, of course, people could measure in the ancient world, give dates and places, but there was no such thing as history in a pure sense or universal sense. Absolutely not. It's always qualified. History is historia, is an account, it's a chronicle. One chronicle among others, and it's always by someone. As far as dates and places, yes, you can give them, but what is the sense of a date and a place in the ancient, in Genesis, or in the Book of Moses? What is this? What does it mean? Is it to be taken in, to fit the scientific bill? Is in what context are these numbers thrown out? Was he 100, 200 years old? What is the context? What is the sense of days, for example, in Genesis 1 and 2? In Genesis 1, first day, second day, third day. These are logical entities. They're poetic entities. They're not to be understood in modern scientific terms. Did they not know how to count the days? Were they days? Were the days of the gods? What kind of days are they? It is ludicrous and irresponsible to assume, to flatten everything out and assume that the context that we give to dates and places is the same as the one, it corresponds to the one that the ancients gave to these numbers, to these terms. So the context of measurement is what is the key, and that is poetic. It's not flaky. It's not all of the other adjectives that you throw out. No, it is serious, and it's being poetic. It's also tied to the problem of authority. So, of course, numbers are originally letters, part of everyday language, which is poetic, and it's a poetic middle between divine actuality and what we could call beastly chaos. So there's something, you could say the potentiality or possibility or darkness, and something that is beneath us, and then there's something above us. So and in the middle there's this what I've called the pivot of conversion. Now, and on this, again, there's the Vogelin View articles that I don't know if you looked into them, Paul, but I've addressed these issues at some length. And I might be coming up with another one, a lengthier article, title of which is the bankruptcy of evolutionism. I read the bulk of it in one of those videos, but it's easier to read it because it's pretty dense. Now, today, again, time is abstracted symbolically, okay? And the leaving the technological case addresses this issue. Maybe some other article does as well. But all linguistic notions are. And you can refer also to MacIntyre's After Virtue. It begins, and I think it's a preface, with this dream, almost. Yeah. Imagine if our language had been corrupted to the point where words don't mean what they originally meant. Maybe they mean the opposite. We don't know. They're all scrambled up, and the meanings don't correspond to the terms. And how do we get out of it? Okay, he gives an historicist answer to that, so we don't get out of it. We just have to play with this in the labyrinth. But a Platonist will give it, I think, a more mature and challenging and inspiring answer. You speak about considering Jesus born in the flesh in a certain time, etc. Yes, but the time and flesh are in a context. Okay, what is the nature of that context? Okay. Again, a challenge for us. It need not be a challenge for the shepherd, um, outside of the modern exposure. Now, to object to Taylor's translation, say, well, you bring up Taylor's translation. Well, the book you bring up as an authority offers an interpretation, okay? To object to it is not necessarily to make an historicist objection. You seem to be suggesting that, oh, I can object to it, but then I'd be an historicist. That's absolute baloney. If he has a wrong translation or wrong interpretation, you can examine it and question it, okay? And again, I refer to you to Jacob Klein for the difficulty of this problem of abstraction that we have in the modern world. Strauss does not call it a cave beneath a cave for nothing, or a second cave. It's a cave of abstraction, of reifications. And when you reify terms, you end up with a slanted, twisted, corrupt, with respect to the original, sense, reference. The reference of the term has shifted. Now, the ancients understood that as a possibility. Incidentally, you refer to Buddhism. Well, Buddhism has these stories, where you live in a realm where words no longer mean what they were supposed to mean, what they meant in their origin. Even the Analects of Confucius, are dealing with that very problem. Now, the Greeks, you suggest, reading Taylor, were interested in the actuality of things, the actuality that they saw. And of course, this brings up a problem. Is what we see actuality? What does it mean to be interested in something? I mean, when you're interested in something, you make use of it. You're interested in it for something else. So I'm interested in this. I'm not disinterested. To be disinterested is to appreciate something as an end in itself. To be interested is to see it as useful. I could use this for something else. That's interesting. So you're not interested in the actuality of things unless it is something that you see. But for the ancients, you don't see the actuality of things. This is a very strange proposition. You seek the actuality, and again, actuality is a term that calls to mind Aristotle, probably, and his Latin translators. What do we mean by that? What we call reality, you speak about reality as something that you see. Well, it's a big question mark. Does it amount to what you call material characteristics? What about appearances versus reality? Where is that? In your account of things, we have lost that crucial distinction between appearances and reality. It's irrelevant to your account. Do you provide a synthesis of the two? Classical Greek sculptures, well, what are they all about? Well, you could say that they're more human in a sense, but we have to understand this proposition than other ancient sculptures that you show all in the video, these so-called primitive, abstract entities. But by this I mean that the Greek sculptures exalt the human form as best or favorite mirror of eternity, and as this middle ground between two poles. Okay? Not the human as this rough for us and even brutal center of gravitation and finally synthesis of the poles, but as a graceful opening up that brings us into dialogue, and that somehow is that dialogue, represents the dialogue between the poles. So the human form here, I think we can understand that it is a symbol in the respect that it gathers all human forms to mean one thing. It represents them, okay? Just as this hero in a certain story represents all of the particular heroes. Now, you move on in your discussion, and here I'm looking at my notes, distinguishing the moderns and the ancients. You say, well, essentially what you're saying is that the moderns end up with an ontological reductionism. Everything is material, ultimately. Whereas the ancients had ontological variety. These are terms that I'm supplying here for the sake of clarity. In other words, they thought, okay, there is matter, but there's also other things. But I think this is misleading. Okay? I think it's misleading because obviously there are other things in the modern world. Question is, okay, you say, well, what is fundamentally the case? The rock bottom. And the rock bottom is kind of material exuberance. Okay, yes. But the evolutionists don't want to leave it at that. Okay, you could say that for some ancients, the rock bottom is monism. So kind of there's a God, something is ultimately the case, and then from there you end up with various creations, manifestations, extensions, right? Emanations, okay? But here the emanation is understood in a new way, this derivation, because the beginning is bad, is imperfect. So you could say it's material, the beginning, whereas in classical antiquity, the beginning is something perfect that has been corrupted, and so there's two different beginnings: the absolute beginning and the partial and the vulgar sense of beginning. But again, the modern cave has lots of things. You could say, well, it is ultimately reducing everything to matter. It still wants other things, I think, but there is a tendency clearly to collapse everything. But that's not what is really peculiar about the modern bubble. Modern bubble is the evolutionary bubble. It entails the adoption of Platonism and an attempt to synthesize Platonic idealism and you could say pre-Socratic materialism. So you have a new type of progressivism, a new type of idealism, which is progressive. It's matter itself that is driving politics, and it's transforming itself within politics. So you have something new, something radically new. It's not just matter at this point. You have another something that is not of the order of matter. So you have the evolution of matter into life forms. These life forms cannot be accounted for adequately by matter. What accounts for both is technology, the new synthesis. So it would be misleading and false, really, to suggest that in our society we say that everything is matter. No, matter, then you have, and this is also to some extent Hegelian, but here it's the coming of age of Hegel. We have matter, we have the social, the human, and then we have the resolution technology, really. And you come back to Jesus, and at the end of this intervention of mine, this response, we have Jesus coming back. And you're suggesting that I say that he is literally false, and that I would, and you have this, you bring this word in my mouth, that Jesus is a metaphor. And then from there on, you bring up the clip with somebody interviewing Jordanson, suggesting that for him, Jesus is a metaphor, where he's literally false. I never said that, never implied that. And what can I say? The letter, the question is, what is the context of the letter? That's the question. Okay? I'm perfectly at ease with saying that he is literally true. The problem is, what do we mean by that? Hence the misleading association to Peterson, of course. I wrote here, and via him to modernity in general, so you are eager to wrap things up, and you do this by eclipsing everything that I had said. So you're eager to bring me to characterize me as a modern. That's patently absurd. When I say that Jesus is a poetic image, and you say, okay, say, in your defense, I would say that sometimes you come up with propositions to the effect that you're not sure about what I'm saying. That's great. I mean, that you acknowledge that. When I say that Jesus is a poetic image, I do not imply what you, Paul, infer apologetically. And speaking of the character in the story, a character that means something. What he means is not something of the order of the physicality that you're used to conceiving of. That meaning is real, and the character is therefore true. Now, oh boy, I have more notes here, and let's try to make it as quick as possible. So your notion of matter, I've addressed, is modern. You address it in an abstract, modern way. So, again, materialists speak of material foundations as atemporal objects of contemplation. When they spoke of water, fire, they don't mean these terms in modern scientific sense. Okay? And again, our everyday life experience is mediated by modern language. That doesn't mean that we can't come out of that cave, but there is a cave, and you pretend that we're still in the first cave. There's no second cave. Hence, the first strenuous objections that you had at my referring to a second cave as being something that Strauss referred to, and then you dropped that, you accepted that. And I don't know what you're making of that, but that's definitely a problem for us today, a problem that the ancients did not have to face. A problem that shapes our everyday language and experience. Okay? We're still rooted, but it's as if we had a second fall. You know, the first fall, biblical fall, Adam and Eve. Now we have a second fall. How do you get back? How do you get back to Garden of Eden? How do you get back to the first fall? Now, I have no point going over the problem of matter, but aside from saying that matter is wilderness or nature. So the problem of matter is the problem of nature. So to say that everything is material is not really enlightening. What is nature? Is it res extensa? Is it in that Cartesian sense? The ancients do not conceive of matter as res extensa, juxtaposed to what? Res cogitans. So the ego versus this stuff that doesn't have any meaning. So our notion of nature obviously is not theirs. It is our notion is neither purely philosophical nor purely vulgar, but a synthesis. In fact, I would say a bankrupt one at that. Well, you insist. Now, I'm skipping a bit. I apologize for the fragmented treatment here. You insist on Jesus' universality, but you don't seem to appreciate the meaning of universal. Okay, you seem to take it for granted. But universal entails an abstraction, which is performed by men. Again, to look at the philosophical import of logos in John, the Gospel according to John, is not to be a Hegelian, it's to be a Platonist. Big difference. I don't know why you bring in Hegel as if, to consider the logos of John and as bound to philosophical discourses, discussions, were to take a Hegelian position. That's absurd. Divine reason beyond human reason. Is there such a divine reason? And you say, yes, of course, we're in agreement. But the question, and here I'm reading my notes, that is philosophically significant, pertains to their proper original relation. So what is it? What do we have? Do we have human reason? Then it stops here, and then we have divine reason on top. That's pretty schematic. Might work nominally, grammatically for some, but is it realistic? And then you speak of the divine and the human as if they intersected only in the Jesus that you find in the Gospels, or in a universal one, because then you say he's a universal above other distinctions, earthly distinctions. So in this universal, they intersect. But he is. Do they not? The divine and the human do they not intersect in our daily life? They can. They can. Poetically and through in virtue. There is in the hero, there is the presence of both the human and the divine. So you state that from a religious perspective, you don't ask niggling questions about God. You love him. Whereas philosophy does that. And so philosophy, from a religious perspective, must be impious. No piety. Must be unjust. Really. So you juxtapose purity of the heart to perfection of mind. So the religious guy asks for the purity of the heart. Philosopher, perfection of mind, which must be impious. What do you make of fides querens intellectum? Again, faith seeks understanding. Rational, Platonic impulse of early Christianity throughout the Middle Ages. There's a purity of the heart. But it's not Kierkegaard. Purity of the heart is tied to the perfection of mind. That's the ethical tied to the metaphysical. There's no ethical aside from the metaphysical. They don't intersect only in Jesus, but in our daily lives. Imitatio Christi is a reminder of this. So this is the classical alternative to what I consider to be a modernist understanding and exposition of Christianity that, Paul, in your discourse, you seem to me to represent. Platonic philosophy gets itself near to Christianity. This is, I think, I'm quoting from your discussion. I say, no, absolutely not. No. Platonic philosophy comes closer to it's near Christianity. Well, Christianity, you claim, closes the gap between religion and philosophy, and again, I would say no. It represents, in my notes I have, it represents or confirms the legitimacy and irreducibility of mediation between poles, reason and authority, in the vulgar sense. So, what does that mean? Why does Platonic philosophy does not come closer to Christianity? Because Christianity is itself constituted through Platonic philosophy. If anything, it comes close to the Hebrew Bible. When it comes close, it produces Christianity. So, you could say with the Christians that Plato was anticipating Christianity. The natural philosopher, natural reason, was getting ready for a Christian revelation. But that's a big story that I think it would be unwise to take face value. So, you speak about Jesus, of course, but on the other hand, I never hear you speaking about Christ, the category of the Christ. And of course, you will admit there is such a category, but I think that there is a dynamic there. There is a relation between the two terms, and that relation is discussed at length by our medieval sources, and I think it's important to understand what is meant by Jesus. Now, finally, you address the question of theology open to philosophy, and philosophy open to theology, which is what Leo Strauss calls for. But then you reduce that to you understand in terms of Christianity open to Greek philosophy, most notably Platonism, I presume. But it's Christianity. Is this what Strauss was calling for? I think that Strauss was making a classical point. Authority open to divine authority, open to philosophical reason, human reason, and human reason open to divine authority. I think that was the point. And when he's speaking about theology open to philosophy, what kind of theology would that be? Of course, theology is a term that seems to it calls to mind Christianity, but what kind of Christianity would that be? Theology open to philosophy. It is an authoritative theology. Okay, and of course he's also speaking about a modern context. So modern theologians should open up and to philosophy, because of course medieval Christians were more open than modern ones are to reason. And of course Strauss acknowledged that. Now Paul, you suggest finally that without Christianity the Roman Empire might have ended up by the year 800 into our modern situation. Oh my. Well, this is again for me an instant in which you come across as underestimating completely the impact and the import of the modern Machiavellian revolution that responds to Christianity. Hobbes does too. All these great modern thinkers would not have written what they did had they not been exposed to and faced Christianity. They're responding to Christianity. They're turning it upside down, if you like, but taking things from Christianity and trying to achieve something that had never been that nobody had ever achieved before. Okay, so you could not have the modern situation without Christianity. Okay, it just doesn't evolve out of I don't know, greed or out of materialism, as you seem to argue. It's just the materialism carried on into the radicalized materialism. It's much more than that. The progressive import. Radicalized materialism would be, I guess, assuming that everybody could become a contemplative materialist. That's impossible. What would it mean to expose the city, the polis, to philosophical materialism. That would require a transformation of materialism. Right? It's no longer contemplative. It's progressive and it's modern. Okay, so that's something new. Can we escape that? Can we flee that? Can we come out of that cave, the second cave? Yes. Can we get back into the first one? Probably not. I mean, probably not. Except that we can appreciate the first one. We can hardly imagine it, but we can think about it, and we can definitely raise the question of what is outside of any and all caves. Okay, I think that's key and crucial to this. There will be a possibility of painting, of other activities, noble activities, but I think that they will require a lot of hard work, a lot of study, and getting out of any cave at all. Not the second, no, that's out of the second, but also out of the first one. Okay? All right. I think this tour de force has come to an end. Bye-bye. For me, good night.